The monitor couldn't decide which heartbeat to scream for. Hort one line other failure. In the hallway, transplant and NICU teams shouted over the hiss of sanitizer, while Evan's pen hovered above the consent form. 2 hours earlier, she had only come in for nausea. 2 hours earlier. The sliding doors of St. Bridget Medical Center sighed open and let the night spill in wet pavement. Exhaust, and that sharp, clean bite of disinfectant that always feels like a lie when you've been here long enough. I was at the triage desk pretending my coffee still had warmth, watching the waiting room breathe in slow waves. A teenager with a swollen ankle. An older man arguing with his insurance company on speakerphone. A woman asleep upright with her head against a vending machine. Then I saw her, one hand braced under the curve of her belly like it was something fragile and sacred. The other clutching a crumpled plastic bag with prenatal vitamins and paperwork. 3rd trimester, maybe 32, 33 weeks. Cheeks pale in a way makeup can't hide, and eyes that kept blinking like she was trying to wake herself out of it. Her name was Lena Hart, and she apologized before she even spoke. Which is how I knew she'd been trying not to be a problem for too long. "I'm sorry," she said, voice thin as hospital sheets. I can't stop throwing up. And my skin feels like it's on fire." Her husband hovered half a step behind her. The kind of man who looked sturdy until you watched his fingers shake as he held her insurance card. "We're in network, right?" He asked me, too quickly, like if he said it out loud it would protect them from whatever had chased them here. I told him we'd take care of her first, and sort the rest after, and he nodded like he believed me, but his eyes stayed fixed on the card as if it were a life raft. I led them back past the curtains where the air is colder, and the sounds get louder, wheels squeaking. Monitors chirping, the distant slap of hurried footsteps. Lena climbed onto the stretcher with careful movements, breathing through something she wasn't naming. And I caught a whiff of sweet bile when she turned her face away to gag into the bag. When I wrapped the blood pressure cuff around her arm, her skin felt clammy. And when my fingers brushed her wrist for a pulse, it was fast and light, like a bird trapped behind ribs. "Any pain?" I asked, and she hesitated, eyes dropping to her belly. "Not pain," she whispered, more like pressure. "And my head feels thick." The husband, Caleb, I learned from the intake form, tried to smile at her, but it didn't land. It slipped off his face and fell somewhere between them, heavy. The first lab results came back like a door slamming in a quiet house. I'm not the kind of clinician who rattles off numbers to impress people. I'm the kind who watches how the room changes when someone sees them. The resident's mouth went dry. The attending stopped mid-sentence and stared at the screen as if it might apologize and correct itself. Lena's blood wasn't doing what it should, and her liver silent workhorse, the organ nobody thanks until it quits, was waving a white flag. Within minutes, the hallway outside her curtain filled with bodies and clipped voices. The way storms gather without warning. Someone said acute failure. Someone else said transfer, and the word transplant hung in the air. Like a curse you didn't want to repeat in front of the patient. Lena watched us the way patients do when they realize the adults in the room are suddenly scared. She kept touching her belly, not dramatically, just a steady pressure of her palm, as if she could keep the baby anchored with willpower alone. I leaned in close so she wouldn't have to hear the whole orchestra of panic behind me, and I told her we needed to move fast, that we were going to bring in specialists, that she was in the right place. She tried to nod, but her eyes glassed over, and she blinked hard, fighting the fog. "Is my baby okay?" she asked, and the question wasn't really a question. It was a plea, a demand, a line in the sand. The monitor beside her answered first 2 heartbeats, one steady and small, the other racing and worn out, both insisting on being counted. Caleb stood near the foot of the bed, reading every face like it was written in a language he should have learned before tonight. He asked about timelines, about flights to other hospitals. about whether their plan covered this kind of thing, and I could see the shame baked into every practical question, like love should be free of paperwork. When a neonatologist arrived, scrubs printed with tiny stars. Eyes sharp, with sleep deprivation, she spoke softly to Lena about the baby's age, about lungs, about what too early can mean. Then a transplant surgeon pushed in behind her, voice low and urgent, talking about windows closing and options narrowing, and suddenly the curtain didn't feel like privacy anymore. It felt like a thin fabric trying to keep the universe from barging in. I watched Lena's hand tremble against her abdomen, felt the room tilt toward a choice no one wanted to name yet, and I understood why Caleb's gaze kept flicking between her face and the monitor. In this place, love becomes signatures, and time becomes something you can hear every beep a second spent, every second a debt. And before anyone said the words out loud, the air already carried the shape of the impossible equation waiting for us down the hall. By the time I arrived, Lena's room had that crowded edge of a cliff feeling, too many hands to little space, and a silence underneath the noise that meant the body was starting to lose the argument. I'm Dr. Nora Klein, neonatal attending, and I'm used to being called when everyone else has already decided something terrible might happen. The fetal monitor paper kept spilling out in pale curls, and the baby's heartbeat, normally a quick, stubborn drum, started dragging like it was wading through thick water. Lena's eyes tracked the ceiling lights instead of faces, and when she tried to answer a question, her words came out slow, as if she had to reach for them across a long hallway. Someone said her blood wasn't clotting right anymore, and the nurse's gloved hands came away with a smear of red from that should be bun clean. The air smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic from the monitor, and underneath that, the sour note of fear-old coffee and adrenaline. Lena's skin had taken on a strange tint, not quite yellow, not quite gray, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She pressed her palm to her belly again, but this time it wasn't steady. It was pleading, the way people touch a door they don't want to open. Is he still okay? She asked, and I hated how the last word lifted, hopeful, because hope is heavier when you have to carry it out of the room. In the hallway, the transplant surgeon spoke in a low voice that still managed to cut through everything. We're running out of time, he said, not to me, but to the world. He kept his tone controlled, the way you do when control is the only thing you can offer. And he held a phone like it was the last thread keeping her attached to a system bigger than our panic. The OB resident stood with her arms folded tight across her chest, eyes flicking from Lena's belly to Lena's face, like she couldn't decide which patient she was allowed to prioritize. I watched the adults do what we always do in a crisis, arrange ourselves into roles decisive, cautious, furious, come so no one has to admit we're scared. Then Lena vomited again at just nausea. It was her body rejecting the script we'd been pretending we could follow. She turned her head, gagging, and for a second her gaze met mine clearer than it had been all night, and I saw something like apology there, as if she was sorry for making this complicated. A moment later, she slumped back, eyes half-lidded, and her hand slipped off her belly like it didn't have the strength to keep holding on. The fetal heart rate dipped again, the paper tracing a quiet warning we couldn't ignore, and the nurse adjusted her position. Gentle but urgent, like rearranging a child in bed after a nightmare. Her husband pushed into the doorway at the worst possible time, because the worst possible time is usually the only time families get. He was Evan, legal name Caleb Evanhart. I heard someone mutter from the chart, but his face looked like a man who had forgotten his own name. He wore a jacket that had been rained on and never dried, and his hands kept opening and closing as if he were practicing letting go. "Talk to me," he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. No one answered right away, not because we didn't have words, but because the truth was too sharp to hand him bare. We moved Lena toward the ICU, and the corridor light strobed across her face, as the gurney wheels rattled over seams in the floor. She tried to lift her head once, confused, and whispered, "My mom." Did she? Then the rest dissolved into a soft sound that wasn't quite a sob. Evan walked beside us, keeping pace, staring at her like if he watched hard enough he could keep her from slipping away. I leaned toward him and said the only honest thing I could without breaking him in half, "Your baby is struggling too, and we may have to act fast." He nodded, but his eyes didn't blink. They just fixed on the idea of fast, like it was something he could bargain with. Inside the ICU bay, the teams collided neonatal OB, transplant, each carrying a different definition of rescue. A nurse pulled me aside and said the newest compatibility call had come back with something unusual, and I felt my stomach drop before she even finished explaining. The transplant surgeon stepped in, jaw tight, and said, very quietly, "We may have a match, but it's not coming from where you think." Evan looked from him to Lena, then to the monitor that held to heartbeats like to ticking clocks, and I watched the moment he realized the choice wasn't coming later. It was already here, waiting for his signature, and it was going to ask him to choose a future he would have to live inside. The consent form was only 3 pages, but it felt heavier than the entire ICU bed. I'm Mara Ellison, the night shift transplant coordinator, the person who stands between a family's terror and a system that demands boxes be checked before it will allow mercy. Evan sat in the plastic chair like it had teeth, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on Lena through the glass, while her monitor kept chirping with that bright, indifferent confidence machines always have. Every time the baby's heartbeat stuttered, his jaw tightened, like his body was trying to bite down on time itself. In the hallway, the arguments didn't sound like shouting at first. They sounded like professionals choosing careful words, which is always worse. "Doctor!" Patel from transplant spoke low and fast about how Lena's liver wasn't just sick, it was failing in a way that doesn't turn around with pep talks and fluids. About how the window to keep her alive was measured in hours now. Dr. Klein from NICU held her ground with the calm of someone who has watched tiny chests fight for air. 30-something weeks is not a death sentence, she said, but an emergency delivery in this chaos. With Lena's blood refusing to clot, could spiral. Ob stood between them like a rope in a tug-of-war, eyes flicking to the ICU doors, as if Lena might hear them through concrete. Then Dr. Patel said the sentence that changed the air in my lungs. "The only compatible cells we have right now are from the baby." He didn't dress it up as a miracle. He said it like a fact with edges, and Evan's face went blank the way people's faces do when their brain has to reboot. I watched him mouth the words silently, testing them as if he could make them mean something else. From the baby. Cord blood. I explained when his eyes snapped to mind stem cells collected at delivery. The kind that can sometimes be used to support a failing organ or buy time while a donor search keeps running. It was not a guarantee, not even close, but it was a rope thrown into a flood when there are no bridges left. Evan kept asking the same question in different clothes. "So you're saying you have to deliver him, to save her?" He didn't say my wife or my son, not yet, like naming them would make the choice more real. I told him the truth without the brutal math. Delivering now could give us something we can use immediately. But it would mean a very premature baby meeting the world under fluorescent lights, in a room full of strangers, with a ventilator and a team that would fight like hell to keep him here. Waiting might allow the baby more time to grow, but Lena might not have that time. And if she crashed hard enough, both heartbeats could disappear from the monitor in the same minute. He stood up and paced until the soles of his shoes squeaked on the waxed floor, one hand dragging through his hair until it stuck up like he'd been shocked. "She wanted this baby more than anything," he said, and it wasn't a statement, it was a confession. He stared at Lena through the glass again, and I saw him searching her face for permission she couldn't give. Her eyelids fluttered, unfocused, her lips dry and cracked, and her hand kept moving weakly, insistently toward her belly like an instinct older than language. The fetal monitor trace dipped again, and Dr. Klein's mouth tightened. She didn't need to say out loud that the baby was already paying the price of Lena's failing body. Then the insurance call came back, because in America even a life-or-death sprint has to trip over paperwork. The representative's voice crackled through my phone, polite enough to be cruel, asking for codes and authorization and documentation of medical necessity, as if necessity wasn't sitting 10 feet away. Sweating and slipping into confusion, I gave them the attending's name, the ICU bed number, the urgency, my own badge ID. And still the answer came with qualifiers covered if approved, approved if criteria met. Criteria reviewed by someone who had never smelled antiseptic at 3 in the morning. Evan heard only fragments, authorization, out-of-network risk, experimental, and his shoulders hunched as if debt could physically crush him. So, if I sign, he said quietly, and he doesn't make it, and she doesn't make it, I'll still owe. He couldn't finish, because grief and money don't belong in the same sentence, but hospitals force them to share a bed. We moved into the family consult room, the one with the fake painting and the box of tissues that no one wants to touch first. Dr. Patel slid the consent packet across the table, and Dr. Klein sat opposite, hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched, not as a tactic, but as restraint. The OB explained risks in plain words: bleeding, infection, the baby's lungs. Lena's worsening confusion while I watched Evan's eyes dart from page to page, hunting for a line that said there was a third option, a loophole, a way to keep his vows intact without sacrificing the future. The pen in his hand trembled, hovering above the signature line like a needle above skin. Outside the room, the ICU monitor beeped on, steady and merciless, reminding us that the decision wasn't philosophical. It was imminent. When Evan finally looked up, his eyes were wet but his voice was oddly clear. If she could talk, he said, she'd tell me not to trade him for her. He swallowed, throat bobbing hard. But if I don't sign, and I lose them both? I don't know if I can live inside that. No one answered right away. Because there are moments when medicine runs out of language, and all that's left is witness. And as the pen tip touched paper, I realized the form wasn't granting permission, it was assigning a lifetime of memory to one stroke of ink. This is the dilemma beat that drives the episode toward its decisive climax. Block 5. The climax, the fight, the operating room felt too bright for what we were about to do. Like the lights were insisting on clarity when all we had was urgency. I'm Dr. Sienna Rowe, the OB attending on call. And I've learned that the body doesn't care about our debates once it starts collapsing. Lena's skin was cool under my gloved hand, her eyelids fluttering as if she were trying to stay with us through a thick underwater fog, and the monitor kept spitting out to rhythms that no longer sounded like a duet, but like a chase. Evan stood at the threshold in paper scrubs, hair shoved under a cap that didn't fit his panic, staring at Lena's face as if he could memorize it fast enough to keep it from changing. Anesthesia spoke gently to Lena, asking her to squeeze fingers, to look at a light, to answer her name, and Lena tried, she really tried, but her words slid apart before they could form. The nurse held a basin near her cheek, wiping bile and tears with the same patient care you'd use on your own sister, and I saw the smallest stubborn motion of Lena's palm toward her belly again, a mother's instinct continuing even when her mind couldn't. Across from me, Dr. Klein's gaze stayed fixed on the fetal tracing, her face still, her hands ready, because she'd be catching the consequences the second I delivered them. Dr. Patel wasn't scrubbing. He hovered like a shadow near the door, a cooler in his hands that looked absurdly ordinary for the hope it carried. When the fetal heartbeat dipped hard, the sound in the room changed, less chatter, more breath held. I didn't announce my fear. I felt it in the way my shoulders tightened against the weight of the sterile gown, and in the way the scalpel handle seemed to warm in my palm. Now, I said, not loud, but final. And the team moved with that practiced precision that only comes from living through other people's worst days. The first incision always feels like crossing a line you can't uncross. And as soon as I opened, Lena's body answered with a threat. Blood that wouldn't behave. Blood that seeped and spread as if it didn't recognize the rules anymore. Pressure, I heard, and hands pressed. Sponges appeared, suction hissed, and the room filled with the wet. Metallic smell that no amount of antiseptic can fully erase. I worked fast, but not reckless, because speed without control is just another kind of violence. Come on, kid, I thought without meaning to, as I reached the uterus, and Dr. Klein stepped closer. A second set of steady hands ready to take a life that still belonged, by every moral instinct we had, inside its mother. The baby emerged, slick and silent, and for one brutal beat the room seemed to stop listening. Like even the machines were waiting to hear whether we'd earned a sound. Then there it was, a thin, angry cry, more protest than strength. And the NICU team moved in like a well-rehearsed storm. Dr. Klein didn't smile. She didn't have the luxury. Not yet, but her eyes softened for half a second as she watched the baby's chest fight upward. They wrapped him in warmth, placed a tiny mask over his face, coaxed breath into lungs that weren't ready for the world. And the baby's fists flexed like he was arguing with gravity. "He's here," someone said. And the words landed in my chest like relief and dread braided together, because being here was only the beginning of his battle. "Cord blood," Mara said sharply, and the cooler was suddenly at the field's edge, waiting. The collection happened like a ritual, quick, careful, sacred in its own clinical way because we all understood what it meant. A newborn's first gift might be the thing that kept his mother alive long enough to ever hold him. Across the drape, Evan made a sound that wasn't a sob and wasn't a laugh. And I turned just enough to see, his eyes locked on the tiny bundle being moved toward the warmer. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white, as if touching anything would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for. Lena, meanwhile, tried to leave us. Her pressure dropped, her skin went ashen, and the bleeding surged like a tide that had been waiting for permission. "Stay with me," anesthesia murmured, voice low and anchored, while I worked through the steps that are supposed to save a life clamp. Stitch, compress each motion deliberate, each second loud. In the corner of my vision, Dr. Patel took the cooler and ran, not dramatically, but with the focused urgency of someone carrying a match through rain. The last thing I saw, before I forced my attention back to Lena's open body, was the ICU hallway beyond the OR doors. A corridor that had become our battlefield and our courtroom all at once. The place where this signature was turning into consequences. The first thing I remember after the doors swung shut is the quiet that doesn't feel like peace. Just a pause where your mind tries to catch up with what your hands already did. I'm Evan Hart, and I stood in the surgical corridor with my cap crooked and my fingers stained faintly blue from cheap ink. Staring at the floor, tiles like they might tell me whether I'd just saved my wife or betrayed my son. The air was cold enough to raise bumps on my arms, and everything smelled like bleach and metal. Like the building had scrubbed itself clean of whatever just happened inside. They let me see him through glass before they let me touch anything. He was impossibly small, wrapped tight under warm lights, his skin a bruised kind of pink that made my throat close, and a clear mask covered his face like a hand I couldn't move away. A nurse adjusted a tube with the gentlest fingers I've ever seen, and the monitor above him flickered with numbers that meant nothing to me, except that they were still moving. When he flexed his tiny fist, it looked less like a baby's gesture and more like a protest. And I found myself whispering his name into the hum of machines, because I needed the world to know he existed. Then they walked me to Lena, and I hated that the path was only a hallway, because it felt like crossing into another life. She lay surrounded by equipment that breathed and beeped where she couldn't. Her face paler than the sheets, her lips cracked, her hair tucked back as if someone had tried to make her look like herself again. The nurse's voice stayed soft when she explained that Lena had lost a lot of blood, that they'd stopped the bleeding, that her body was still in shock, that the next hours mattered. I nodded like I understood, but my eyes kept locking onto Lena's hand. The one that had been reaching for her belly all night, now resting open and empty on the blanket. Someone, Mara, the coordinator, told me they'd taken what they could from the delivery, that it was already moving through the hospital to where it needed to go, fast and careful, like carrying a candle through wind. She didn't promise it would work, and I'll always respect her for that, because false hope is its own kind of cruelty. She just said it was a bridge, a way to buy time when time was the only currency that mattered. I looked at Lena's chest rising with help, and I realized that buying time was the closest thing to a miracle a place like this ever offers. The waiting room chair tried to swallow me whole. I sat there with my phone dead in my hand, watching strangers laugh, to loudly at ATV nobody was listening to, watching a janitor mop a spot on the floor like he could erase the night. In my head, the consent form kept replaying like a song I couldn't turn off. My signature. The date, the line that said I understood the risks, as if understanding could make any of this fair. I thought about what Lena would say if she could sit up and look at me, and I felt the answer in my ribs like a bruise. She would forgive me. And that would somehow hurt more than anger. Just before dawn, Dr. Patel found me. He looked like a man who hadn't blinked in a week, but his shoulders had loosened by a fraction. And that fraction was enough to make my vision blur. He said Lena had stabilized only the word itself, like a hand on my back to keep me from falling on, that they gained little ground. She was still critically ill, still in danger, still not out of the woods, but her body had stopped sprinting toward the edge for the moment. "Your son helped us buy her time," he said, and I hated how beautiful and brutal that sounded in the same breath. When they finally wheeled me into the NICU, I washed my hands until they stung, because that's what they tell you to do. And because pain is something you can control when everything else is chaos. The nurse guided my arms into position, and they placed my son against my chest like a fragile secret, his warmth impossibly light through the wires and the blanket. I didn't cry right away. I just breathed him in plastic, clean linen, something faintly sweet that made me think of a life that hadn't learned fear yet. And somewhere down the hall, behind another set of doors, Lena's monitor kept time with a steadier rhythm than before, as if the hospital itself was holding its breath with us, waiting to see what this borrowed time would become. The hospital looks different when the crisis stops shouting. I walked past the OR desk at sunrise, and the air had softened, still sharp with disinfectant, still humming with ventilation, but no longer vibrating with panic. Evan was asleep in a chair in the NICU waiting area, arms folded tight across his chest like he was holding himself together, and the paper bracelet on his wrist had begun to curl at the edges. I've seen that bracelet outlast marriages, outlast apartments, outlast the version of a person who walked in thinking this was just a bad night. Lena didn't wake up like they do in movies. It was smaller than that. A flutter of lashes, a faint tightening of fingers around a nurse's hand, a moment where her eyes found the ceiling, and then like a lantern catching found the sound of her husband's voice through the glass. When Evan leaned close and whispered that the baby was alive, Lena's lips moved without sound, and the monitor didn't celebrate. It just kept counting, steady and unromantic. The relief in the room was careful, almost superstitious, as if naming it too loudly might chase it away. 2 days later, the call came that a donor organ was available. And no one cheered because by then we'd all learned what hope costs. Evan signed again, slower this time, not because he doubted the decision, but because his hand remembered what ink can do to a life. I watched him stare at the signature line the way people stare at a shoreline after surviving a rip current, seeing the water differently now. In the NICU, his son fought in inches, a little more oxygen, a little less support, a day without alarms that ended with an alarm anyway. The world didn't offer them a clean victory. It offered them a long, bruised road that still counted as mercy. I kept thinking about that first consent, the one that asked a husband to gamble with a baby's tomorrow to purchase a wife's today. We pretend those forms are neutral, but they are not. They are the place where love is forced to speak the language of liability. I used to hand families a pen and step back, like distance made me professional. After Lena, I started sitting down. I started saying, out loud, that whatever they chose, they weren't choosing wrong, they were choosing in a room where time was rigged against them, and that matters. When Lena was stable enough to be wheeled past the NICU doors, the nurse paused for just a second so she could see the incubator. Lena's gaze landed on the tiny shape inside, and her face changed in a way I'll never forget. Not joy, not sorrow, but recognition, like meeting someone you already love without having earned the right yet. Evan stood behind her, one hand on the wheelchair handle, the other hovering uselessly near her shoulder, afraid of hurting her, afraid of letting go. Lena's eyes filled, and I saw the first real tear track down toward her ear, slow and quiet, as if her body was finally releasing what it had been holding back to stay alive. I don't believe the hospital makes heroes. I believe it strips people down to their most human parts, and then asks them to keep going anyway. Evan didn't choose between a mother and a child. He chose to fight for both in a moment when both sounded naive. And he will carry that decision like a scar that aches in certain weather. Episodic medical drama often ends on this kind of aftermath beat where the case stops being a diagnosis and becomes a lasting mark on everyone involved.